any discussion on the city today, particularly with reference to the English-speaking world, which does not, of course, mean Quebec, is a matter of paramount importance. The reason, at least one reason why, are not only the city problems that we all confront on a world magnitude, not specific to that of the English-speaking world, but that the English-speaking world is going through a crisis about its attitude toward the cities, particularly in the ecology movement, which is one of the reasons why I especially welcome the opportunity to engage in this discussion. More so than at any time that I can recall, and I have been involved in ecological issues since 1952, when I first wrote a book-sized article on the subject, more so than at any time that I can recall over those nearly 40-odd years, or 40-odd years, has there been so much confusion about our relationship to cities, and especially among people who are environmentally concerned. And that is one of the major reasons why I welcome the opportunity to explore the issue with you, namely, what is the city, what constitutes politics, what constitutes citizenship. Because what is happening today, at least in the English-speaking world, is what I call the Stonehenge California Disneyland mentality. What I mean by that is that ecological issues are being completely mystified. And this is not occurring among a very small number of people. It's occurring on the level of elementary schools. It's occurring on the level of elementary schools. In California, for example, I'm told, throughout the elementary school system, and this is spreading, again, California always setting the worst possible example for the world, is spreading through the rest of the United States, or what I call USA, USA, to use a German word, and will probably reach you sooner or later, at least the Anglophones in Canada and Quebec, and probably the Francophones. And that is that ecology is a wilderness issue, not a human issue. That owing to the fact that we are all supposed to be intrinsically on the same level with mosquitoes, ants, viruses, and of course furry little things like friendly grizzly bears, black bears, leopards, lions, and other things that we like to have either for rugs or for coats, or we like to see outside our car windows or in zoos. This is the preservation of wilderness, supposed to be the cardinal function of the ecology movement. And not even by implication, but by direction, explicitly. The view is being presented today that the city is evil. That, and one almost has to go back to Sodom and Gomorrah and the Hebrew scriptures to find an antipathy toward the city so great that people are almost mindlessly rejecting the fact that they use word processors to denounce it, that they use their VCRs to listen to harangues and spread tapes against it, and that we should go, if not back to the Pleistocene, which has been advocated publicly, we should at least go back to the Neolithic, because there everything was just absolutely wonderful and people sat around doing nothing but smelling daisies and lolling in the grass and worshipping goddesses. I don't want to make any derogatory remarks about these sentiments. In some respects they're understandable, because we don't have cities really to a great extent anymore, although there are vestiges of cities where we do find metropolitan areas. But the city has lost its meaning in our understanding of what constitutes our most cardinal virtue as human beings, that which distinguishes us from other animals, and that is the capacity to create civilization, to create culture, to create a tradition, to think symbolically, all of which are wrapped up into one holistic pattern, if I may use that expression. Our capacity to intervene in the world, to be active agents, a capacity, by the way, that is not something that we sort of picked up from some deity, but that is a product of natural evolution. And civilization is eminently tied up with cities. In fact, the word civilization comes from the Latin word civitate, and from the concept not only of city, but also of citizen, civitas, or civitas, as the Latins probably would have called it. So civilization, to Latinize it, is our cardinal achievement. The point is that we don't have civilization, or to the extent that we do have it, it is undergoing terrifying degradation. Our cities are not only, in a sense, disappearing, and I'll go into that in further detail, but very importantly, and this is really terrifying, our notion of what constitutes a city is disappearing. We are losing, in other words, the abstract expression, the word city, to express what cities once were meant to be. And I will explain what I mean by even meant to be. 17%, for example, of city dwellers in the United States today, that is to say those who live in conurbations or standard metropolitan statistical areas, or from a juridical point of view, cities, these are all different terms to talk about urban sprawl as well as what is called jurisdictionally the city. 17% of the people who live in cities today say they like cities. The remainder say they want to leave them. Whether they would leave them, I don't know. But the point is, the claim that they generally express is that for this immense percentage of and I hope you don't mind a little sarcasm and levity here and there, otherwise we become too pontifical and ponderous, and we might dry up and become desiccated. So under those circumstances, when you get sentiments like that, anti-city sentiments, there is implied in that, to a very great extent, anti-civilizational sentiments, at least to the extent that people know what a city is. With that has grown up a vast panoply of myths about wilderness. Ecology and environmentalism are supposed to save our forests and save animals and save species from disappearing. And I'm all for that, by the way. One of the canards that has been spread by opponents of views that I have expressed is that I'm against civilization, that I would sacrifice the last chimpanzee in the world on a test to find out whether a cosmetic is or is not toxic. Such nonsense are things that I would like to immediately erase. I'm not against wilderness, I just don't believe it really exists. When you have to put a fence around the wilderness area and say this wilderness area belongs to the bears and the rodents and the owls and the snakes and the cow, whatever you have, bison and elk, it's no longer wild. It's wild only in the most minimal sense of the term, namely that the animals themselves have not been totally domesticated and the trees have not been totally arranged. When you even have to do that around Amazonia and start planning what will amount to kind of wild Bantu stands, if you know what I mean, reasoning by analogy with that of the Afrikaners in South Africa, wild Bantu stands, wilderness has, for all practical purposes, in my view anyway, really disappeared. What we are witnessing now is the fact that human intervention is now so great that the idea of a nature that can somehow be separated from humanity has now become meaningless to them. And that I would be more than willing to discuss in the question period that we have. The question really is not whether or not we intervene in nature, whether or not we try to preserve wilderness areas, because that is what it comes down to. There is not a penguin in Antarctica that does not have DDT in its fat It does not have radionuclides in its bones. And anyone who tries to deceive himself or herself about this question is turning ecology into a massive myth. A pure piece of entertainment, good perhaps for television. But like the teachers I was talking about in California, as ridiculous as getting a class of youngsters to recite, think like a tree, feel like a tree, become a tree. This is a mass phenomenon in the American educational system today. And not only does it range all over the elementary school level, but it goes into the high school level, and it goes into the university level, it goes into the graduate school level. When you have to tell people such arrant nonsense, then you are preserving a myth, and you are also disarming them about the real things they have to think about and have to be concerned about. And that is, what kind of society do you have? Here I must get a little emphatic and unscholarly. What kind of society do you have that has brought wilderness, if you like, to such a condition, led to such a massive destruction of species, numbering in the scores every possibly week, and in the thousands possibly every year, with widespread deforestation, ozone holes in the ozone layer, and the greenhouse effect. Because if we're going to think like a tree, we're not going to think like citizens. If we're going to think like a river or feel like a river, we're not going to feel like publicly concerned, civically minded individuals who have to create a society which makes rivers clean or prevents the pollution of rivers, which makes, to the extent that it is possible, wildlife to be restored, which makes it possible to maintain our cathedral-like forests, old growth, and so forth. And it totally dodges the issue, and I say this with great vehemence, to ignore the city, and not only to ignore it, but to write it off. This is a very serious problem. That's how germane these discussions should be considered. We are now dealing with the poisoning and the polluting of the spiritual and mental faculties of a very sizable population, particularly in the Anglo-English-speaking world, young people, who are being asked to think like a tree, and are being asked to feel like a river, and not to think about the society in which they live, how they should change it, what kind of forms it should take, and specifically what kind of forms the origin of civilization, namely cities, should take. And this is one of the major thrusts and passions that I feel at this point, without dwelling upon it much longer. The point is that the city, at its best, whether so conceived or so realized, or realized in varying degrees, represents one of the most important achievements, indeed one of the destinies of what we would call the human species. To the extent that we pass over from ordinary animal life, herd-like existences, even if you choose baboon troops, even if you like chimpanzees in the Gombe, studied by Jane Goodall so sympathetically. Incidentally, the chimpanzee has 99.8% the kind of gene and gene structure and gene imprimatur that we have. There's that little 0.2% that separates us. But that little 0.2 that separates us from our nearest cousin, the chimpanzee, makes all the difference in the world, and you have only to look in the mirror, or at least compare yourself to a chimp. The point that I want to make is that we are very, very unique as a species. Not because we have chosen to be unique, but because we have evolved that way through the course of evolution itself. And in the course of evolving this way, we have established very distinct ways of associating. Mentated, if you like, or intellectually alive animals. And I know many of us have pets, and we feel that they're almost like our own children, but let's face it, they don't know what we're saying. And they cannot engage in a philosophical discourse with us, nor can they share our emotional problems as fully as we would like any other human being to do. For that, we go to analysts. And we pay. But the point that I want to get, this qualitative difference, which makes it possible for us to live the way we do, finds its most transcendental, most advanced form in what we call the city. Because the city, or the formation of cities, and the history of the formation of cities, represents a tremendous change in the way we associate with each other. If one goes back in time and studies carefully tribal life, even in the most generous forms, tribes are still, or were, very few are left by the way, or bands, were still kinship groups. What I mean by that is that they were family groups. That whoever, whether fictively or really, shared the same ancestor, belonged to that group, was the person who truly was regarded as human. Not that they did not realize that other humans existed. There are peoples like the Tiwi off the northern coast of Australia who, looking off in the distance, give or take 20, 30, 40 miles from the coast of Australia, thought they saw another ghostly world out there, and that there might be other things like them that walked on 2 feet. But they viewed that world as a spirit world. They believed that's where the ancestors went. And this was not uncommon with many other tribal peoples, as long as populations were sparse. The essence of the tribal relationship is still biological, however much it's conditioned by cultural factors. And this biological essence is, above all, the blood tie, the relationship of individuals to each other, whether real or fictively, through a common ancestry. And so any social order was primarily an order for people within that blood tie, real or fictive, called the tribe, or if you choose, the band, or if you choose, the village. Anyone outside that bond was marginally human, in the sense that such individuals outside the tribe could be killed on the spot once they entered the area of the tribe, and nobody would hold them to account, allowing for exceptions here and there, unless the blood relatives of the individual who was killed took their revenge on the killer. So inside the tribal community, relationships were established around biological facts. And these biological facts were, first and foremost, the idea of kinship. The second one was the idea of gender. The distinction between male and female, which initially, under the most egalitarian circumstances, was a not only division of labor, which we are accustomed to call it, but distinctions or differentiation in culture. There were fraternities and there were sororities, partly structured around the difference in the kind of work that they did. And the third major distinction that existed inside the tribal community were age groups. Whether or not you reached puberty made all the difference in the world as to whether or not you were accepted as an adult or a child. Once you did reach puberty, in many tribal situations, you literally had to change your name. And you were then accepted as part of the institutional fabric of the tribal group, which, as I emphasize, regarded itself, whether rightly or wrongly, but still regarded itself as a kinship group. And I repeat, anyone outside that kinship group were related to each other, was related to others within the kinship group, under very distinct ritualistic and very distinct, almost quasi-legalistic ways. One was through intermarriage, again sharing blood, a common offspring. Two, through the exchange of gifts, which were largely even symbolic, not simply economic, although economic factors played a very important role. And Malinowski's discussion of the Kula trade among the Trobriand Islanders is one of the most informative examples of this, which unfortunately time couldn't possibly make it, I couldn't possibly get into right now, but mainly symbolic. A third was through alliances which the men made with the men across the tribe. Namely, common understandings which could lead to confederations, which could lead to temporary alliances in view of common enemies. One typical case in point is the Battle of the Little Bighorn, in which Sitting Bull managed to bring tribes that normally did not work together, the Cheyenne, for example, and the Lakota. And I beg you all to forget about movies like Dancing with Wolves, which is not only a libel on the Indian peoples, but is an absurdity and a travesty of history. Bring the Lakota together with the Cheyenne and still other remnant tribes to finally make one last stand against the U.S. cavalry, namely the famous defeat of George Custer. Such alliances were possible. Thereafter they broke up. And only rarely did you find anything comparable to the Confederacy of the Iroquois, which incidentally's main purpose, and I don't care what any Indians tell you today, because we have all kinds of cigar store Indians, just like we have all kinds of cigar store Zionists, just like we have all kinds of cigar store, whatever you like, you name it. The identity business is going wild today. Everybody's discovered an identity. One is going back to the Cro-Magnon ancestors. Confederacy was organized for solely one purpose, mainly to prevent the Iroquois peoples, or the Seneca and the Oneida and the others, Mohawks and the like, from killing each other. The main role was to prevent mutual war and a certain measure of collaboration against common enemies. Otherwise, they had no very great love for each other. Only later on were attempts made to try to depict that Confederacy, as well as other confederacies, as being models of social organization, which they surely were not. Believe that is so. So when we talk of tribal life, well, let's take it even further back. When we talk to the wild ways of living in the wilderness, and when we talk of tribal life, we are talking of very restricted forms, however richly articulated, of social organization. And what we admire most about the solidarity of these social forms is not a solidarity that exists between tribes. The normal situation between tribes was warfare and torture and even cannibalism on a wide scale. But leaving that alone, ritual or otherwise. The main point that we admire about tribal peoples, and with good reason, is the intense internal solidarity that existed within the tribe. A solidarity that would be expected of people who were related as they thought to each other by blood and saw themselves as an extended family. Now, why am I dwelling upon this, aside from ecological issues and the mythologies that the ecology movement, at least certain sections of it, namely the deep ecology types, the mystical ecology types, the theological ecology types, and I can give you a whole salad of them, a vast bouquet of them. Aside from that, why am I making this emphasis? Because the city formed a tremendous turning point in the evolution of these kind of relationships. The city created a new type, and I hate to use this word, but I'll have to, a new type of space. This space was not particularistic. It did not build itself strictly around biological facts, although biological facts were part of the evolution of cities. And we will go into that when we deal with that evolution. But what the city did was create a space where almost anyone, and under the best of circumstances, anyone could live. The fact that we today, of entirely different ethnic origins, people from Asia, people from the Middle East and Russia like myself, people possibly from France, people from various Northern European countries, people of different color, skin color, which is one of the most trivial differences in the world, different anatomies and the like, different color eyes, can't sit in this room right now is entirely the product of cities. Otherwise, we would all be mutually at war with each other. The blondes ganging up with each other against the brunettes, the light eyes ganging up against those with darker eyes. I am not talking of a fiction. I'm not even trying to make a joke. We couldn't get together because given the tribal constraints of human intercourse, the inwardness, let me put it bluntly, the parochial nature of tribal life, however much hippies today are running around hypothesizing tribalization, we have only to look incidentally at the tremendous crises produced by identity to see what a monstrous field of weeds that's growing up today in the name of ethnicity and nationality and xenophobia and racial difference. So, tribalization would have made us sitting here impossible today. And the city is what makes it possible for us to exist. Because step by step, as people de-tribalize themselves or rework their tribal world into something, and I use the word now in a very restricted sense, identifying it with cities, namely urban form, was it possible ultimately for people of the same ethnic background to come together and begin to form a new kind of social area, a social territorialism based not on common ancestry as much as it was on residence, on economic interests, on genuine, serious concerns, and sometimes, quite fictitiously, on religious commonalities or even differences or affinities. I recently, only 2 hours ago, talked to my good friend Dimitri Rousopoulos about Alexandria during the Hellenistic period and well into the Roman period. And nothing would have been more amazing to say a tribalized person, be it an Indian, be it a Hebrew, be it a whatever you choose, an Arab, be it a Slav, going back to tribal periods, to have gone into a city like that. Because there Greeks intermingled with Persians, with Egyptians, with Latins, especially during the Roman period, with North Africans of all different types, and there lived in a huge community which produced the enormous vibrancy of that cities around the period of the Hellenistic, roughly 200 BCE, before the contemporary era, of the Hellenistic era. So the city plays that catalyzing ecumenical role of finally creating not a folk, but of humanity. The city advances the proposition in principle that there is a shared relationship, irrespective of ancestry, irrespective of ethnicity, irrespective of endless differences that can divide people as we now find today. Identities. The city creates a milieu where you can have a unity and variety that is creative and flourishing, and where human beings are seen as a species and not as specific nationalities, ethnic groups, and the like. That has been the revolutionary role of the cities. And not to appreciate that, to go back instead between the Seneca and the Hurons, a chronic war structured around mutual slaughter, headhunters, anything you want. However much we admire the internal solidarity of these communities, because a Huron helping a Huron far and away surpasses a Quebecois helping a Quebecois, a Burlingtonian helping a Burlingtonian, a New Yorker helping a New Yorker, a Torontoan helping a Torontoan. Still, there is a recognition that we are all human. And very importantly, whether we live up to that standard or not, is the fact that we have even created that standard, that we have formulated it, that we have at least established it as a humanistic ideal, which prior to the emergence of the cities, one, would have been impossible for the most part. Not that there are always that there weren't examples. And secondly, even over much of the course of history, would have been very difficult to conceive, with the possible exception in medieval Europe, of the unifying role of the Catholic Church, the Latin language, Christianity in general. So we have gone beyond, because of the city, from folkishness or from folkdom to citizenship, or a citizenshipness, as it were, as a whole condition of human life. Now the question is, what kind of structures should a city contain? And very importantly, and I want to take that up first, what are the dangers that now exist? What is it that is absorbing the city? What is it that is dissolving the definition of the concept of city, and with that the concept of citizenship, and with that the concept of civilization as such? What is destructuring the city, the citizen, and civilization? Traditionally, the argument that used to be given was the greatest antithesis to the city was the countryside. I have, in fact, one of the classic discussions of this subject, and that is by Marx himself in Capital, which is well worth citing just to give you what was regarded as the traditional antithesis of the city. And I will quote from Marx, if you don't mind. Marx says, "The foundations of every division of labor that is well developed and brought about by the exchange of commodities is the separation between town and country. It may be said that the whole economical history of society is summed up in the movement of this antithesis." And when Marx made statements like that, despite what the press now says about Marx, socialism, Marxism, and I'm not a Marxist, but I do want to defend a great thinker, okay, and one who has greatly influenced all of us, directly or indirectly, is as sweeping as the statement that opens the Communist Manifesto. The history of all hitherto existing society is the history of class struggle. To go on to state that the whole of economic history, I'm summarizing, but more or less using his words, consists of the contradiction between town and country, reflects an opinion that goes as far back as Aristotle's time and even earlier. In fact, it goes as far back as the murder of Abel by Cain. The biblical story is an analogy. It's a metaphor, as it were, of how it came about that the pastoralist, namely Abel, was slain by his brother, the first example of murder in the Hebrew Scriptures, who was an agriculturalist. And agriculture, being the basis in great measure for city life, represented in that respect anything that impeded the movement of the nomad. The nomad must be free. He belongs to earth first. He must be able to wander. He must express himself openly. Nothing must impede his way. One of the great goals of Genghis Khan, many of you may or may not know, was to literally exterminate the population of China so that all of China could be turned into pasture land for pastoral herds. And that was also the program which was partly responsible for the extremely bloody, almost genocidal nature of the Mongol invasions into Russia and further westward into portions of Eastern Europe. So that the city, almost symbolically, stood as the impediment to the natural free-roaming existence of the male. And this carries over into Marx's concept, partly justified, that a great deal of economic history can be summed up as the contradiction or antithesis between the town and the country. That used to be the case. For quite some time, it is no longer the case. On the contrary, what has finally happened to the countryside is certainly in the Western world, in fact in that vast ecumene called Euro-American civilization, and to a very great extent in the Third World, not to speak of the second world, is that the countryside has in fact become urbanized. That urbanization has taken several forms. The development of a form of agribusiness in which the factory system is the model for the cultivation of food. And the factory system is eminently a product of urban development, one that can be circuitously but clearly traced back to the emergence of the city as a source of manufactures as well as a marketplace. So we not only have the urbanization of the countryside rendering the antithesis between town and country meaningless today, because the countryside itself has become urbanized. And in what ways? The cultural urbanity has spread out into the countryside. Television sets, mass communication, the automobile, the whole constellation. I wish to make a distinction between cities and urbanized entities in the sense that urbanized entities that I'm talking about consist of vast, massive, cityfied types of sprawl which totally destroy the definition of the city, destroy its scale, destroy its intimacy, destroy its cultural texture, destroy its social articulations. That's my point. We now have a phenomenon that has no comparison or bears no comparison even with this cityfication that began to emerge some 10,000 years ago. And that is the spread within recent centuries, and specifically the spread most emphatically within our century and going back in certain countries to the middle part of the 19th century, of what are called vast urban entities which no longer can be identified with the city, except that we can pinpoint here and there certain physical facts, namely close human propinquity, certain forms of communication, certain activities such as trade and commerce, which we associate with the emergence of city life. The scale on which this has occurred is absolutely phenomenal, and it is worth very briefly trying to go in to some of the changes that have occurred only within the past century or so. Let me take cases in point. In 1900, in the United States, only 1 out of 10 people lived in what could be called cities. And by the way, the Census Bureau defined the city as anything containing 5,000 or more people. 5,000 or more people. We today would call that practically a village. 1 in 10 lived in urban areas, and I'm now using the word in terms of city, lived in urban areas. 1 in 10 lived in urban areas that consisted of 5,000 or more people. By contrast, at the present time, in 1990, 8 in 10 live in what could be called metropolitan areas. That is to say, 80% at the very least live in what are classified as cities, and I would say the figure is probably closer to 90% if you start including suburbs or the way in which towns are merged into each other so that you can't tell the difference between Yonkers and the Bronx, and you can't tell the difference between Westchester County, if any of you are familiar with New York City, that is to say the area directly north of New York, the Bronx, and the rest of New York City. This is a revolution of phenomenal importance. Within a span of less than a century, we have shifted from 1 in 10 into 8 in 10, and probably closer to 9 in 10 in the United States, who now live in what are called urbanized areas. A minimum of 85% of the people in the United States live in urbanized areas. And the rapidity of the development is absolutely phenomenal. If you take specific cities, Consider, for example, just within what are expected to be populations in major cities from 1880 projected up to the year 2000. 1980 projected up to the year 2000. I'm only talking of a 20-year span. It's expected that New York will grow from a metropolitan area of 15.6 million people. The official size of New York is approximately 8 million. From 15.6 million people to 16.8 million people. This is only within 20 years. Tokyo will grow from 16.9 million people in 1980 to an expected 19 million within 20 years. Mexico City from 14.5 million to 25.6 million. That is to say, a figure that is an increase by approximately 80%. Los Angeles, needless to say, will grow from 9.5 million in the year 1980 to an expected 13.9 million. I'm talking of the same areas now. And finally, Sao Paulo in Brazil will grow, and this is phenomenal, from 12.5 million in 1980 to an expected 22.1 million. And actually, Tokyo is known at the present time to number really, if you include the metropolitan area, 20 million. Additionally, you have a new kind of phenomenon called standard metropolitan statistical areas, because now they've given up the 5,000 as a figure for what constitutes living in a city, when I was younger. And today, we have roughly, between Boston and Washington, 15% of the United States population. That would be closer to the truth to say approximately 20. That is to say, we have a huge urban belt extending from the city of Boston to the capital, Washington, D.C., which is now moving all the way down to Atlanta. So that Atlanta is being tied up with Washington. In other words, we are talking of virtually the entire east coast of America, of the United States, is turning into one huge urban conurbation, which will probably contain about 1/4, 1 out of every 4 Americans, population being 250 million right now, give or take. The area from Buffalo to Milwaukee, a huge sweep clear across the Great Lakes, is expected to equal or possibly exceed the population I've described between Boston and Washington. And from San Diego to Los Angeles, the urbanization is so intense that it is hard to find greenery as you travel along these huge California freeways, as they call them. Some of them extending up to 6 lanes and even 8 lanes, where you have, at times, bumper-to-bumper traffic. So one must realize that we are not only talking of the effacing of cities, urbanization on a scale that exceeds anything the world has ever seen. And in no sense of the word can these standard metropolitan statistical areas, can these conurbations, to use the British term, be regarded in any sense as cities any longer, nor can the countryside that partly supports them and that is partly nourished by them, and I use the word nourished with quotation marks around it, through television and other mass communications, regarded in any way as being countryside anymore. What they are fields that have been turned into factories, to do a play on Kropotkin's expression. In Canada, and I'm sorry to include you, unless you are not fiery Quebec nationalists, approximately 80% of the Canadian population lives in one or another form of urbanized area, defining urbanized areas resembling a standard metropolitan statistical area or a conurbation. Okay, take a case in point. 3 major cities, that is to say, 3 of the big cities in Canada that exceed 1 million people, and 3 of 5 smaller ones. And by the smaller ones, I'm referring to Calgary, Winnipeg, Quebec City, Hamilton, St. Catherine, Niagara. That is to say, they have less than a million, but more than 500,000. Okay? All put together, that entire constellation today totals, and I have the total here in just a moment, totals, you'll have to do the totaling yourself. I thought I had it here, and I really did, and I just didn't write it up. I would give it 3, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, approximately 11 out of your 24 million population, or 25 million people today. 11 million live in just these areas alone. In Europe, 90% of England, Britain, Great Britain, the UK, is urbanized. 90%. This was the beefsteak country of the 18th century. The famous, above all, land of the British yeomanry, the small-scale farmer, independent, strong, individualistic, etc. In Germany, over 80% is now completely urbanized. In Russia, 60%, and this is a particular torment to me, my beloved Spain, which during the time of the Spanish Civil War had approximately 65% living in the countryside and consisting of peasants. Now, 65 to 70% live in cities, and the rest are industrial, essentially agriculturists. Although there are always pockets in Spain of more traditional forms of food cultivation. In the third world, Shanghai will leap from 11.7 million to 17 million between 1980 and the year 2000, and Beijing 9 to 14 million, Calcutta 9 to 15 million. In general, these are 40 to 50% increases within a span of only 2 decades. I could go on with these statistics, and I don't want to burden you with them. I have enormous statistics on Brazil. I have examples of the extent to which this is due not to population growth, but is due to the depletion of agricultural areas, or former agricultural areas. For example, 1 out of every 3 American counties, that is United States, is emptying out. It's not that population alone is increasing. It's that people are leaving the countryside for the cities for economic reasons, for cultural reasons, in the best of cases, and usually coming up with the worst possible results. But for some sensibility or need, either economic or cultural, to go to cities or are being driven to cities. And this phenomenon was observed on such a scale that in Italy 300,000 people a year were leaving the Italian countryside for cities. With the result that increasingly Italian agriculture, such as it is, to the extent that it can compete in the common market, is gradually becoming, in fact not gradually, rapidly becoming industrialized. The same phenomenon is going on in France, the peasant country par excellence, the product truly of the great French Revolution, which gave the land to the peasantry, which provided that basic peasant substratum of French society, as well as, when they came to the cities, of French culture, and peasants who later became craftspersons working in cities, were the ones who really provided the fuel of the great revolutions, not only of the great French Revolution of 1789 to 94, but of 1848 and the Paris Commune of 1871. It was such great, and they're disappearing. They're disappearing. So what we are talking about today, very bluntly, is a tremendous transformation taking place at the present time, not 150 years ago or 200 years ago, of the destruction mutually of both the city and the countryside. Or, if you prefer to use a more polite word, the absorption by both country and city, by both town and lands, into huge urban agglomerations and a new type of phenomenon called urbanization. So urbanization must now be seen as the principal antithesis to city life. not ruralization. Rurality, in point of fact, is being urbanized. Urbanization now forms the opposition to citification. And in doing so, urbanization thereby is producing an entirely new constellation of problems. One, the destructuring of the city, and we will not discuss city structures further. I can use it in a more colloquial sense, the destruction of neighborhoods, the destruction of the remotest vestiges of community. In fact, so nuclear is this development that one can say it's even involving the destruction of the family. My son, his friends wander around like gypsies. In other words, a nomadic world has been created in which people move through this urban ocean that is gradually engulfing so much of what we once called countryside and city. And with that, deinstitutionalizing civic structures that form the basis for citizenship, a subject into which I will try to explore at a point when we get to the development going from tribe to city and what city meant. So we are seeing today a massive, as it were, homogenization of social variations that have been in the making for thousands of years, going back to tribal life, transcending tribal life into cities, into municipalities, and finally, even in the larger cities, neighborhoods, with all the institutional articulations, and finally the family, which is not only nuclear, but absolutely fragmented. And where communication now takes the form of an occasional visit by parents to children once, twice, or 3 times a month, where contacts that actually should be growing are truncated, and the young leave, go off on their own way, or the parents leave and collect in Miami to get the sunshine, or in Arizona to deal with their arthritic problems, while the young fester in another part of the world, particularly in such marvelous areas as California, Ecotopia, and points north, up into Vancouver, with all due respect to Vancouver. So this urbanization problem is a social problem of immense dimensions that can best be understood by trying to find out more clearly the role of the city and the kind of cities that have existed historically. And secondly, the extent to which this urbanization problem has rendered all our basic ties structureless, amorphous. In other words, what we are seeing is not simply a destruction of civilization, but a desocialization of people increasingly into atoms who are basically often nomadic, who have no roots, who have no ties, who have no commitments. And then we wonder why gangs form in Los Angeles. We wonder why people turn to drugs. We wonder why it is that there are single-parent families all over the place. We wonder why the divorce rate is the way it is. We wonder why there is no form of consociation, no form of community, no form of neighborliness, no form of mutual aid. Now, the growth of the city does not flow in a vacuum. I mean, the growth of urbanization does not flow in a vacuum. One of the most important traditions that came out not only of tribal life but of city life was the idea of limit. The Greeks called it peres, P-E-R-E-S, limit, the idea that there should be limit. And it was part of much of city practice, even by expressing the presence of a wall when necessary or unnecessary, to create a sense of definition. The emergence today of a market society, particularly over the past 3 centuries, that has finally taken over everything, where everything that is made to be sold, where everything that we wear is no longer anything that we made, that everything has now been made for production and finally for profit. And above all, in a market situation based on rivalry and growth, growth becomes an end in itself. And urbanization today is precisely correlated with, and more precisely caused by, the expansion of the market. The way in which the city is now defined is as a business enterprise. The success of a city overwhelmingly is whether or not you have a balanced budget, whether you provide the right number of goods and services for the amount of taxes that you create. In other words, the market relationship has entered into the civic relationship. What we today call civicism in any sense of the word, municipalism in any sense of the word, given the warped image that we have today of what constitutes a city, is that it is an arena of goods and services in which we are not citizens, we are consumers. We are constituents. And as constituents, we are entitled to certain goods and services. And the success of a city is measured, as would be the success of any corporation, on what the budgetary surplus is, what the goods and services are. A city is a realm of goods and services, just like the Bergen County, New Jersey shopping mall. Goods and services. And the cash register, expressed as the budget, is whether or not a city is a success if it comes up with a surplus, balances its budget, and meets all the standards of good business operations. And when you view a city from that point of view, and I will show you that there were entirely different points of view in the development of the city. When a city is seen from that standpoint, the city becomes a capitalist enterprise. It becomes a marketplace with capitalist enterprises. It therefore does what capitalism does best. It takes its profits, and this is supposed to be when it does its best, invests it back into the industry, corporation, to make the corporation bigger and bigger, so that Toyota can swallow up General Motors. General Motors might be able to swallow up, so they would like to believe, Mercedes-Benz, etc., etc. I merely give you the automobile situation as an analogy. So once the city has lost any cultural meaning, and it had many different cultural meanings, and I will point out, once the city has ceased to be an ethical union of people, as distinguished from a biological union in the tribe, and instead become an economic enterprise, a corporate form, whose success is measured by the extent to which it supplies goods and services for the taxes it collects, then the city will turn into an urban blob. It grows like a corporation grows. And its success is measured by the success of a corporation. And once that can be fixed, and very importantly, once we can counterpose the city, be it a religious center, be it an ethical center, be it a cultural center, be it an administrative center, or be it a combination of all three and more, to the idea that the city is merely a corporation, and that its customers, citizens have been replaced, have been turned into customers and producers, then at that particular point, urbanization becomes inevitable, just as economic expansion becomes inevitable. And the growth of cities is considered to be as important as the gross national product, which must always grow to provide employment, so that so you can have further growth to provide more employment, further expansion, further growth, and the ecological consequences of this are nothing less than incredible. I need hardly tell you that. I have spoken approximately an hour and 15 minutes, and I have another theme to take up, so I want to give all of us an opportunity to have a moment of meditation, to think like people instead of a tree, feel like people and citizens instead of a river. And I'd like to ask for a glass of water, if that's available, please. Do you want to take up any questions? Or should I show you from my lived experience how cities have turned into urban globs? Because I did something very unusual, maybe not that unusual. I got some very old pictures of New York City dating from the Civil War, 1860s, up to about the 1920s, which already now falls into my own lifetime. I took these pictures, I photographed them, put them on slides, and then I went to the very places that these pictures were supposed to represent in New York City. And I tried, to the extent that it was logistically possible, to show you what they look like how they have been changed, more precisely, over the past 60, 70, 80 years. No more than 80 years. Or roughly about 80 years. Okay, because most of the pictures that I took are already 20 years old. And if you want to have a look at those, give me a show of hands. I think the majority would like to see it. So I'll tell you what, we'll take a break in the form of looking at these slides, if that's agreeable to you. I will have to give you a running commentary. I hope you don't mind. Okay? Because I know the city very well. I grew up in it 71 years ago. And without making any snide comments about a city I once loved, what to me was the Paris of the United States, or what you may have regarded as Quebec City or Montreal in Quebec, have to endure the prospect of going back in time to a world that is now gone forever, and that'll also give us the time to rest up. Can somebody turn on the machine? Thank you. I'm pressing forward now. What do I have to do to make this work? Nothing is happening. Should I try it now? I'm not getting any results. Well, I'm afraid somebody will have to work the equipment. If not, do it by hand. Well, what do you know? Now let's bring it into focus. Wait a minute. What are you doing? Oh, you've gone way ahead. Please start from the beginning.
No, we didn't press
You were at the
anything.
beginning just a moment ago.
Well, we didn't press anything. I think it was you who pressed.
Well, then it hasn't been put on correctly.
Maybe it went on backwards.
Press it backwards.
This is ridiculous. I don't know what to tell you. Can somebody please put that on?
There we go.
There.
Very good. Now, what should I do to get it into? Will you get it into focus? Good. Thank you. I hope I haven't seemed insulting. These various different colors that you see over here, and I won't try to go into detail about them, actually represented very distinct villages in New York City and neighborhoods. That is to say, from the time that New Amsterdam began, and it went no further than Wall Street, which, as you can see, is right up there in the yellow area and the red, right at the tip of Manhattan, constituted New Amsterdam, and what was then the financial district constituted more or less of a slum area, after which much of it was farmland. And then you had Greenwich Village, which at that point was made up mainly of semi-mountainous, hilly areas.
What year was that?
I'm going back to the very beginnings of Manhattan. I'm not talking about, I'm trying to tell you the origins of all these different blocks.
What year roughly?
You mean what I'm talking about at this moment?
Yes.
1567 or 1600. Let's make 1600 a good round figure. New Amsterdam. Good?
What's the orientation of this map? Maria's north isn't at the top.
Okay. You're looking, frankly, from south to north, or north to south. South being where it says Whitehall.
Okay.
North being the remainder. There is Central Park. And I want to be as brief as possible about this for only one moment, if I may. All I'm asking you to consider is that these were once distinct neighborhoods, and the early part, around the 1700s, were distinct villages. For example, Harlem, which is now called Harlem, and is notorious or famous, and culturally so, for having been a major center of black culture, was once a Dutch city named after the Dutch city Haarlem in Holland, or the Netherlands. And so you had New Amsterdam, and then you had Greenwich Village, which was a city in the process of, a town in the process of formation. And you see Greenwich Village being the yellow area. You can read all of that, can't you, I hope? And you had Chelsea, and you had what they call most of this the financial district, but that isn't the point. Up there, Peter Stuyvesant, near the East River, has his remains buried there, and that was a very well-known Dutch area. The word Bowery, which has a terrible reputation today as being, the dumping ground, and it isn't anymore. It's now become the yuppie center of the so-called, I put quotation marks around it, bums or down and outers and alcoholics, originally meant in Dutch farmland, farms. So you had that large farmland area. So these different colorations that you see over there, to one degree or another, reflected different neighborhoods and also reflected different... What should I do?
You're going the wrong way, that's your problem.
I know.
You keep on going backwards instead of forward.
All right, how can I make this go?
You discipline yourself.
I give up. What button should I push? Does anyone know? I wish you'd cut it off. Do it manually, please.
Just click your fingers off, press it.
What? Okay, bring it back to the beginning again where we had the map. No, we're far away from the beginning. Let's cut the slides out. Please bring it back to number 1. This is not working out, is it?
We'll get there.
It's up to you, okay. Now, does somebody want to push it on to number 2?
Here you go.
And here you see them more distinctly delineated. Well, I don't know if you can see much. Now you see them more distinctly delineated. Please go on to next, please. More distinctions, and this is the upper part of Manhattan, where there were distinct villages before Manhattan. Even while Manhattan was incorporated into New York City, they essentially took a village-type form. Washington Heights was distinctly a semi-rural area, as many of you, or some of you may know, that was the last battle that George Washington and the colonial forces, or revolutionary forces, fought before they left New York City. But it was a distinct area. And the same is true of most of the other areas around there. East Harlem was a Dutch village and remained for a long period of time a very distinctive ethnic neighborhood involving the whole succession of people ranging from Italians, Irish, Jews, and then blacks, that being the essentially black so-called ghetto, but also a very stimulating cultural area. Could you please go on? Let's go further. Please go on. Here you see the entry from Staten Island to the very tip of Manhattan, where the ferry goes from Staten Island, if any of you are familiar with New York, across part of New York Bay to the very tip of Manhattan. This is the ferry district. This is the way the ferry district looked approximately 100 or so years ago, I would say even less. Incidentally, this was the place that most people entered the United States before Ellis Island was opened up as an immigrant clearance center. And there you'll notice that there's not a single building that is larger than Trinity Church, which is the church all the way over on the left-hand side. Okay?
What's that round building, Murray? You know?
The round building was an immigration center. People were taken there to be examined medically and so on and so forth, registered, until Ellis Island was opened up. By the way, I can't... Oh, you're talking of this round building, not
Yes.
that one. Oh, that was basically a ferry lobby, if you want to call it that, a place where people who took the ferries from either there to Brooklyn, to Staten Island. By the way, there was no Brooklyn Bridge in all probability at that time. If my memory is correct, it was still being built, because the Brooklyn Bridge was built after the Civil War, and this is roughly in the period either shortly after the Civil War or during the Civil War. So that rotunda over there was very much like a place in which you dined while you waited for the ferry to come, where you congregated, and by the way, marked by a good many amenities that are totally gone today. just like airports today become totally sanitized, no longer charming places in which to wait for your plane to take off. Please move it further. This is a shot of the same thing right there. It's pretty much the tip of Manhattan, and that's what has been replaced.
Where's Trinity Church?
Hmm?
Where's Trinity Church?
Trinity Church would be impossible to find in that stack of high-rise, what's the word for skyscraper buildings? These are the twin towers of the World Trade Center. So Trinity Church is gone, and the very idea that a church any longer has the kind of, how shall we put it, stateliness and sovereignty that from medieval times until comparatively recent times nobody should build above, because it defiled the name of God. It showed disrespect for a religious body of beliefs. But that is called urbanization. Please go forward. This represents a period around 1898, already the turn of the century, where you're beginning to see not so much skyscrapers, but the beginning of skyscrapers. The skyscraper, by the way, has its real origin in Chicago, as you may know. And notice this basically simple scale, the spike, and the Gothic, and what we would mistakenly call the Art Deco, but actually neoclassical form of the buildings. You notice that? Could you please move on? I was obliged to take this picture at night, but this is exactly the same area, except from a different angle. And this is what has essentially replaced it. Only this building, the Customs building, remains from the past. Everything else, or virtually everything else, including that monster up there in the front, has replaced it completely. This is what I mean by urbanization. Please go forward, please. Thank you. This is the beginning of what could be called Battery Park. Okay? And they were clearing the area to make a park over here. Again, notice Trinity Church rises above all the other buildings. The period is roughly around that of the Civil War. Please go forward again. This is what it looks like now. And I tried to find exactly the spot where the previous photograph had been taken, and I took this. This monstrosity right over here is what has finally supplanted it. Needless to say, you can't see the church. And then the famous sign, keep off the grass. The normal situation in New York is you're not supposed to enjoy anything that's natural, just look at it. Please go on. Here you see an almost classical area around the time of the Civil War, with the kind of structures and building and the scale that existed. Please go on. And this is what you see today. Exactly the same building, by the way, refurbished, with the same 4 pillars. It's now been called the Siemens Museum. Please go on. This is the vibrant port of New York around the 1880s, when we still had sailing ships. Notice the casks. Notice the huge... there's an energy here that I think most people can sense as a seaport area. You have a sense that you're in a seaport. This seaport might have existed 300 years ago, it might have existed 200 years ago. Please go on. And this is what you see now. And this, by the way, is called the Pocket Park in New York, that sanitized piece of rather leafless junk.
Home sweet home in there.
There remains still some of the old buildings. You notice the red one there? Squeezed right in there. That building goes back to the era of the previous picture. Please go on. This was the days of the famous sailing ships in the background, notice that, and the famous elevators of that era. Please go on. This is what you have in exactly the same area today, only taken from a different angle. There the camera was pointed toward the East River. Here the East River was to my back, but that was all that there was to my back, the East River. And in addition, there was a great highway running up there called the Franklin D. Roosevelt Drive. This is what I call urbanization. Please go on. Again, notice the energy, the feeling, the vitality of a port going back roughly to about the 1880s in New York. Please go on. This is what exists now. Exactly the same spot, or almost exactly. I couldn't quite, what I mean, get the same elevations and overviews, but this is what you have replacing it today. Please go on. Here again, New York as a port, and this is going well uptown toward the Brooklyn Bridge. If any of you know how the bridges are located across the East River, Williamsburg Bridge, Williamsburg Bridge, and so forth. Again, cobblestones, trolley, horse-drawn, vibrancy, energy, human scale, a feeling that things can happen in a place like this. Please go on. Thank you. And here again, notice Union recruiting offices since the 1860s. And there you see a Union soldier from the Civil War, period. Please go on.
Beautiful home,
I know. This is what has replaced it. This is what has replaced it. That's what they did to my New York. Please go on. Again, a view, this time probably from the Brooklyn Bridge. Please go on. A view today from almost the same area, with a few of the buildings remaining with dormer windows. Notice that? Going way back in time, but this is what forms the backdrop. This is the famous Fulton Fish Market on a Sunday. It's been closed. Will open again probably around 11 o'clock at night, and then begins that energy. But the rest of it, in the background, is what has replaced the city. Go ahead, please. Here again, another view of the Port of New York. Notice well again that you can see Trinity Church. Please go on. This is still an old part of the city, again the Fulton Fish Market, more or less in the same area. Please go on. This is Wall Street. Wall Street has existed around 1880. At the end you see Trinity Church, right? The amenities are interesting. I still remember in the 1920s the window awnings that existed in apartment houses. You see them over here? The scale is human. Larger than a village, naturally, 5 stories high, in some cases even more. But nothing higher than the church. And if it were not taken, perhaps, at a time when possibly a Sunday or so and the streets were empty, it probably would be filled with people. Please go on. I couldn't take it from the same view, but there's Trinity Church, and this is what's replaced it. This is Wall Street. Meet it. That is what I would call urbanization. Please go on. Here again, Trinity Church, seen from the steps of the Treasury Building. Please go on. Could you go on, please? Thank you. This is what you see now near the steps. There's the Treasury Building. Well, it's not quite. That's the stock market. But the Treasury Building is right nearby. That's what it looks like now. You can't get any sunlight there, by and large, except for about 2 or 3 hours in the day. The buildings are so tall, they're so unscaled from a human standpoint as to be monumental. Please go on. I may tell you, by the way, that was taken on a Sunday, and consequently the streets are totally vacated. That area is literally unoccupied on a Sunday, or a Saturday for that matter. During the week, it's packed with people going to jobs in stock brokerage houses and the like. Here you see the beginnings of City Hall Park, the famous Franklin Square area, which was the major center of newspapers and printing in New York around the turn of the century. Please go on. Same area. There's City Hall Park, and this is what's replaced it. And yet this is not even regarded the worst in New York for. Please go on. Here again, that area viewed from another standpoint. It's notable that there were amenities like a fountain, which have totally disappeared from City Hall Park, and for that matter from all New York City parks. There were fountains, and there were trees, and there was a feeling, an attempt to try to create a more hospitable type of environment. The buildings were fairly colorful. This, by the way, was red together with painted a marble type veneer or decoration. Please go on. That's what it is today. Please go on. There's more of it today. Please go on.
Lincoln Center there.
Huh? That's Benjamin Franklin,
Oh, yeah.
who typified printing. You see, that was once the printing newspaper section. The Tribune was located there, the Herald was located there, and Horace Greeley's time. And Benjamin Franklin was put up as the patron saint from the secular point of view of the printers. Please go on. That's about it. Well, can you go on? Well, let's cut it off at this particular point. Well, here was New York. This is City Hall with New York City Park. This is a parade. We're not well focused, actually. But that was a parade of soldiers, and they were carrying the body of Grant, General Grant in the American Civil War. He had died, and they were commemorating him. Please go on. And this is what you see today. That's City Hall. That's what's behind it, and that's what's around it. And by the way, the parks are repeatedly fenced in for repairs. They do endless repairs in which nothing seems to be done, and all that seems to remain is the fence. Please go on. Well, I'm going to cut it off from this point on. Go on. Same area again. Go on. Contrasts in the backyards of New York. Same area, incidentally. Please go on. This is the famous Hester Street, the legendary Hester Street, back in the 1880s and 90s, with the push carts, with the very dense Jewish population, with still remains of wooden buildings. Notice that this is totally prohibited in New York today. And this was the main immigration center, or the main neighborhood center at that time, of Jews living on the Lower East Side. Please go on. This is what the damn place looks like now. I stood exactly at the spot where I thought that camera would be. Continue, if you don't mind. Believe it or not, this is 42nd Street and 5th Avenue. 80, 90 years ago, at the turn of the century. And in the distance, you see St. Patrick's Cathedral? See that huge spire? I thought it would interest you to see what's happening now. There is St. Patrick's Cathedral, if you can find it. Notice the huge building going up against it. I found that particularly striking. Please go on. This is famous Grand Central Station. It was beautiful. It was regarded as a fascinating masterpiece of massive monumental architecture. Please go on. This is Grand Central Station, if you can focus it. Okay? Good. This is Grand Central Station. Right over there, and what you see over there is the Pan Am building behind it. In other words, the lack of tastelessness is excruciating. They take a structure like Grand Central Station, a wonderful example of neoclassical architecture, a symbol of people coming together from different parts of the United States in what is the railroad hub of the city, and what they can think of doing nothing better than is putting up this monster, faceless, undecorative, unfeeling, cold, and icy, right behind it, such that you cannot even single out Grand Central Station any longer and photograph it. This is the best photograph I could get of Grand Central Station in any totality, short of going up about 10 stories and trying to capture a section of it the way you saw in the previous. This, by the way, is the median that now separates Park Avenue. Park Avenue leads right into Grand Central Station. Please go on, if you don't mind. This is where the United Nations has now been built, and you might as well see what it looks like. Please go on. What it looked like originally is this sketch that you see over here, and that was not too long ago. That is to say, it was in the latter part of the 19th century, the turn of the 20th. Now, this is what it looks like today. I'm sorry, this is also still part of Turtle Island. Go on, please. It was just a double take. This is what it looks like today. I just want to show you the total effacement of any sense of topography or natural landscaping. Please go on. This is down in Greenwich Village. The tower is a well-known one. It was the fire tower for New York City at a time when New York City could still be seen more or less in its totality from that height. Please go on. This is the same tower, refurbished, rebuilt, turned into brick, okay, and this is what the area looks like today. Please go on. And you remember I showed you Park Avenue? Well, this is the real Park Avenue. It was a park. As late as the 1920s, this area, and there you see Temple Emmanuel off there on the right, which is one of the major Jewish centers built in the 1920s. This is what Park Avenue, which you saw before when you were looking at the Pan Am building, once looked like, and the cars were shunted off to a side. And that, what you saw facing that avenue leading into the Pan Am building, is what this was turned into. With no sense whatever for human amenities, for pleasure, for relaxation, for enjoying the city. Because most of these places were places that you could sit. And there was greenery all around the area. What?
It was a pedestrian way?
It was a pedestrian way. No vehicles went through here. It was a pedestrian way, and the greater part of the way was covered by this lawn. And the cars were shunted off on one single road, up, down, and downtown, one-way streets. What you saw before, namely Pan Am building, and that is one of the most decorated parts of the Park Avenue that we know today, that at least had tulips, which most of Park Avenue does not have. That is what Park Avenue was in the 1920s. Not in the 1850s, in the 1920s. So that within a span of a few decades, in short, one generation or maybe two, they turned that area into what you saw when you looked at the Pan Am building with Grand Central Station. I think that's pretty much it. Shall we put up the light and call it off? You'd better turn that off, by the way, or else it'll just melt it'll melt the slide. Thank you very kindly. I appreciate what you did. Well, that's what I mean by urbanization. It's not the worst examples of urbanization. I can show you worse. But I felt it important for me personally, and because I could talk about it, since I was born into a New York that more closely resembled that Park Avenue, and many of the neighborhoods that you saw, than the New York that exists today. Even the New York skyline, I may say, has changed. But why simply talk about New York? One can talk about Montreal under Drapeau. I saw Montreal way back in the 50s. And then I saw Montreal, give or take, 10 or 12 years later, 15 years later, I think when Dimitri and I met. And then I saw Montreal and Montreal and Montreal. And I've watched the change of the whole skyline of Montreal, namely its Manhattanization. But Manhattanization is not the word. Manhattan allowed for a good many amenities that have now been totally erased. Quite aside from the criminality that exists in New York, quite aside from the racism that exists in New York, quite aside from the fact that New York has a murder rate that exceeds 1,500 people a year, and that's mainly by gunshot wounds. Quite aside from the fact that New York is a derelict city in great part, literally housing people who live in paper boxes in the wintertime, and where vehicles go around picking up the bodies because they have been frozen to death, or people have OD'd on drugs, or people have suffered from acute alcoholism and have died. New York has turned into a cemetery. That's what I mean by urbanization, and the change in scale, even in a very large city that years ago could have been regarded as one of the leading cities in the world, the second largest city in the world next to London. Well, before we go further, if you want to go further, any questions, any discussion?
I have an observation maybe. I'm of Dutch origin.
Of what, please?
I'm from Holland.
Holland?
Yes. And what I find remarkable is that if I look to, let's say, Amsterdam or Rotterdam, there is a core of a city which has an historical survival and which has a sense for Dutch people. And what I feel when I look at the slides you show, I feel there is a philosophical background of predictive and utilitarianism as a mentality, which makes that any other values have been simply overlooked for a long period of time, which has meant that the city as we have it now is something we may look at with a view of regret of what has been lost as a social existence. But it has become the service area you talk about, which makes it possible for us to go in and out and not worry about whoever is going to give us the service we need. And I feel that's what you're talking about, basically, that there hasn't been for a long time a viewpoint about the city of whatever goes beyond the needs, which are like in an economical perspective. And nowadays we're sort of come to a point that we really don't know how to handle this any longer, and we become either romantics and try to look at other solutions than living in the city and doing something with it, because that's what we're doing. If I look to the United States, many cities are dead because people have given up on them and have moved out.
Could you just turn off the fan? It's still going. Thank you very kindly.
That's maybe the question I have, is what do you do with a city that is dying? And I think Montreal is maybe something in a perspective of trying to come back to the city and make it alive in some ways.
Well, first of all, not only do I think that such an endeavor would be laudable in the case of Montreal, I would ask you to allow me one indulgence, and that is to deal with the problem in its right place, if I may.
Mm-hmm.
That is to say, I want to deal with the question of what do you do when you're faced with the kind of transformations you've seen here. And by the way, these transformations are minimal. If I went through New York now, which I wouldn't try to even do, I'd show you scene after scene of people living in paper cardboard boxes, sleeping, even in wealthy neighborhoods. Mind you, wealthy neighborhoods, or neighborhoods where yuppies go to have a good time or live, sleeping in rags piled on each other. Virtually, in other words, human debris living out of, literally, physically living out of garbage cans. What I've shown you here is not the worst. I've merely tried to show you certain contrasts that I think might give you a picture of the problem. As to what you do now, as I told you, I ask you to put that off to when I discuss a new municipal agenda, which is part of our discussion, of the overall discussion. I want to make one observation. If you don't relate this to the all-important social issue that the city has ceased to be a city, that it ceased to be, as I will try to show, an ethical union, a religious center, a source of culture in one form or another. If you cease to think, if you lose track of the fact that the city has now turned into an economic entity, namely that the city is a corporate enterprise, then one loses contact with the source of all these problems. Because then I will have to go back to the question of how you decorporatize. In other words, let me put it to you very bluntly, how one would decapitalize, in the capitalistic sense, the city without, of course, having to go to the kind of state socialism that existed in Eastern Europe, or that persists in Eastern Europe. But that must be kept in mind, that this is a product of the not the idea, of the reality, the economic reality, transmuted into civic form of the idea that the function of a city is to provide goods and services like that of a corporation, to grow and to show a profit margin. Otherwise, a city would be regarded as a failure by urban standards today. That's important to emphasize. Thank you.
One thing that occurred to me while you were giving the statistics for country populations and city populations is that there isn't that much of a change in population of country to city in terms of the actual number of inhabitants of countryside. That in terms, it was fully occupied, say, at 1900, and it's fully occupied today. That all the population increase is happening in cities as opposed to the countryside. One of the things that it makes me think about is probably the inability of new municipalities to develop in the 20th century.
In the countryside?
Well, within the countryside, the countryside, by being structured and occupied and maybe a little and stable, and somehow it doesn't itself give rise to new cities or new towns that develop into cities.
Can I respond to you now?
Sure.
There are two things that I have not brought up, but which your question raises. I would have brought them up possibly a little later, but this is just as good a time as any. And the first question is, A, that large areas of, in particular, the continental United States, in areas such as Wyoming, Montana, Nebraska even, Kansas, portions of Minnesota, and certainly Utah, Idaho, etc., etc. Do you know what I'm talking about?
Well, I know what.
Areas that correspond to Alberta, Saskatchewan, and so forth in Canada. Okay, that these areas are becoming so depopulated that a very serious scheme has been put forward by conservationists and not daydreamers that those areas should be returned to what they were around Indian times. Namely, bison should be reintroduced into these areas and permitted to flourish, wool should be returned to these areas, and so on. So the first thing that's happening is this, that you're seeing a great depopulation of the countryside. In my own state of Vermont, around the 1860s and 70s, Vermont, while not with a much smaller population even than it has now, contained about 73% of Vermont was more or less composed of farms, small yeoman farms, ranging anywhere from 5 acres to 50 acres to 60 acres, 70%. And 30% was forested, leaving aside, obviously, some 5 to 10% that consisted of villages and towns, okay? Because in Vermont you have nothing larger than towns. Burlington, the largest in Vermont, consists of only 40,000 people. Today, the figures are the reverse. 70% of Vermont is covered by forest. If you go into Vermont, what you see overwhelmingly is forest. And even the few farms that exist are dying at such a rate that they will soon be covered by forest land if they're not covered by condominiums or summer homes, or something like that for people who live in large cities. And this sort of thing is happening in large areas of the United States. At the same time, a new phenomenon is developing. That's the second point I want to make. And that's, we used to call this satellite cities. Now they call it new cities. And this consists of urban centers, which are fairly complete. That is to say, they provide you, again, notice the economic mentality. They provide you with the goods and services you require within your suburbia. You know what I'm trying to say? You don't have to go into New York City, given its, jurisdictional limits. You don't have to go into New York City for your job. That's not the issue. Now, what you have is something very different. In Yonkers, you have everything that you can get if you live in Manhattan, including some people living in cardboard boxes and gangs. And so what's beginning to develop around the perimeter of the city, or what you would normally call the suburbs, are little cities which are replicas of the decaying city from which many of these people came, or from which many people in the countryside came. So instead of having cities that live in balance with the countryside,